The first time Gloria Mayfield ever asked for something that was only hers, she was wearing her Sunday dress and carrying a folder so thin you could see her hopes pressed flat against the paper. The Savings and Trust sat on the corner of Willow and Main, a brick building that seemed to look down on her before she ever stepped inside. She paused on the steps, breathing in the summer heat, her little boy's hands sweating in her palm. Maybe she should have turned around. Maybe she already knew what waited for her in there. But 15 years scrubbing other people's floors had taught her that pride wasn't enough to fill a pantry. So she walked in anyway. The lobby smelled like cold air and old coffee. A woman in a blue dress glanced at her, then turned away without a word. Gloria's shoes tapped across the tile as she made her way to the counter. Behind the polished oak sat Mr. Whitaker, a man whose white hair and pink skin seemed to glow in the fluorescent lights. He looked up slowly, as though she was interrupting something more important than her entire future. She introduced herself, voice steady, and pushed the folder across the counter. Inside were 15 years of savings ledgers, letters of recommendation from every woman whose laundry she'd folded, whose children she'd minded, whose floors she'd cleaned until her knuckles bled. She explained she wanted to open a small sewing shop, nothing fancy, just enough to keep her and her boy under their own roof, answerable to no one. Mr. Whitaker didn't even open the folder. He flicked it back toward her with 2 fingers, the way a man might brush away a fly. He said she was not a good risk. His eyes never softened, not even when she pressed her hand over her boy's head, like she could shield him from the sting of that sentence. When she asked why, her voice cracking, he told her the bank had policies. He didn't explain them. He didn't need to. Gloria felt her cheeks burn hot. For one wild moment, she wanted to scream that she was more honest, more hardworking, more deserving than half the men he'd probably shaken hands with that morning. But her son was watching. So she swallowed the fire in her throat and gathered her folder. The corner was bent now, crumpled from the push of his fingers. It was a small thing, but she knew she would remember that crease until her last breath. She turned away. She caught her reflection in the glass door. Her lips pressed thin, her eyes shining with a shame she hadn't earned. She thought about all the times she'd knelt in kitchens, scrubbing floors while her employers pretended she was invisible, and she wondered if this was just her place in the world. A woman meant to clean up after everyone else, never daring to own anything of her own. Outside, the sun had gone down behind the bank, casting a long shadow over the sidewalk. She held her boy's hand tighter and walked home in silence. Each step felt heavier than the last. She could feel something closing around her chest, squeezing until it hurt to breathe. But she kept moving. She would not let that man's smirk be the final word. That night, Gloria sat at her kitchen table long after her son fell asleep. The folder lay in front of her, the papers now smudged with her fingerprints. She traced the numbers she'd written so carefully, proof of every hour she'd spent working when her body wanted to quit. She thought about the jars of coins she'd hidden behind the flour, the dresses she'd mended for next to nothing, the polite smiles she'd given to people who wouldn't meet her eyes. All those years, she'd believed that if she was good enough, polite enough, hard-working enough, someone would open a door for her. But maybe doors like that were never meant for women like her. Maybe her skin would always be the excuse they needed to say no. She felt something inside her start to splinter, something that had been holding her upright for a long time. Then, in the quiet kitchen, she closed the folder and stacked her hands on top of it. She took a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass. And she made herself a promise. They would not see her beg. They would not see her break. If no one would give her a door, she would find a window. If no one would hand her the chance she'd earned, she would build it herself, brick by brick. Even if it took the rest of her life. The first few years passed slow as molasses. Gloria started with 2 regular customers, Women from Mount Zion Baptist Church who needed their Sunday dresses let out or taken in. She set up a sewing machine in the corner of the living room, right next to the window where the afternoon light streamed across the worn carpet. Every morning before dawn, she tied a scarf around her hair, brewed a pot of coffee, and stitched until her fingers ached. When she finished one garment, she hung it on the back of the door and moved to the next. Some days she did not step outside until evening. Word traveled quiet and steady. Folks who knew her reputation for neat hems and strong seams passed her name along. Soon she was sewing uniforms for the deacons and bridesmaids' gowns for the daughters of the congregation. Every dollar went into a jar she kept under the sink, tucked behind the cleaner. At night, after Darren fell asleep, she'd count each bill twice, smoothing them flat so they didn't look so small. She told herself she was saving for the day she'd try again. The day she'd walk into another bank and dare them to turn her away. But there were days when the world seemed determined to remind her where she stood. Once, Mrs. Hensley, who lived 3 doors down, brought over a pile of curtains to be hemmed. She stood in the doorway, purse tucked under her elbow, and asked in a syrupy voice if Gloria was planning to move up in the world. Said it like it was a threat. Like ambition in a black woman was a stain you couldn't scrub out. Gloria smiled, said thank you for the business, and shut the door soft enough not to be called rude. But inside, she felt her jaw lock tight. She knew what that word meant. Uppity. She'd heard it all her life. It was the label they pinned on you when you refused to stoop. Darren was growing fast, tall for his age, with eyes that missed nothing. She tried to keep him from hearing the slurs whispered behind her back, but children have a way of collecting every scrap adults drop. He saw the way some customers glanced around her small living room, like it was something to be ashamed of. He noticed the envelopes marked past due she tucked into a drawer when she thought he wasn't looking. One winter, the power company sent men to shut off the electricity. She'd stretched the last payment too far, hoping another wedding job would come through. Darren came home from school to find her sitting in the cold kitchen, rubbing her hands together for warmth. He didn't ask why the lights were out. He just carried his school books to the table, lit a candle, and started his homework. She watched him from the sewing chair and felt something fierce and tender rise up in her chest. He deserved better than this, better than the cheap pity in the grocer's eyes, better than the tight smiles of women who thought their charity was a gift instead of an insult. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind crawl through the cracks in the window. Her son slept under 2 blankets, his breath soft and even. She promised herself she'd never let him feel small for needing help. But she'd also teach him to stand up straight, no matter how many times the world told him to bend. The next morning, she boiled water on the gas stove and washed her face in a cold basin. When she opened the door to collect the next pile of mending, she held her chin high. She thanked the woman on the step without a trace of shame in her voice. She stitched each seam neat and strong, as if every thread was proof that she was still here, still standing. Darren watched her closely in those years, memorizing the way she moved, the way she folded every finished garment with care, the way she smiled without showing her teeth when people tried to make her feel small. He saw her slip quarters into his lunch bag even when she was down to her last dollar. He heard her pray. At night, her voice soft but certain, asking God to help her keep going. Some nights, when he thought she couldn't hear, he whispered to her through the thin walls that he loved her, that he was proud she was his mama. She never answered out loud, but in the dark, she pressed her hand over her heart and held it there. Because no matter how long the fight lasted, she was not going to let them win. She would sew, she would save, and she would stand tall. And one day, she would show them all that she had been a good risk all along. Darren was 15 the first time he walked through the same glass doors that had slammed shut on his mother's dreams. The savings and trust still smelled of old coffee and stale air, But to him, it was a chance to bring home a paycheck. He needed the money for school supplies and to help keep the lights on. Gloria had tried to talk him out of it, said there were other places he could work, but he shook his head. Maybe some part of him wanted to stand on that floor, to see it all for himself. Manager Mr. Whitaker barely looked up from his paperwork when Darren was introduced as the new janitorial boy. Just a flick of the eyes over his pressed shirt and a grunt that sounded like approval, or maybe dismissal. Darren couldn't tell the difference, and he decided he didn't care. He would do the job and take the money home. But as the days passed, he realized he was seeing the same ritual over and over. Every morning, he watched the line of customers snake to the counter. When an older white man stepped up, the teller's voices changed. They called him sir, offered him coffee, acted like he was doing them a kindness by coming in. When a black woman about his mother's age came to cash a check, the same tellers leaned back in their chairs, eyes flat, voices clipped. Sometimes they asked for extra identification. Sometimes they pretended not to hear when she asked a question. He saw it happen dozens of times in those first weeks, and it made something hot and restless grow in his chest. In Mr. Whitaker, he was worse. He had a habit of calling black customers by their first names, even when they were older than he. Was Darren heard it again and again. Betty, you need to fill this out. Charles, you're overdrawn again. But with white folks, he stood up, smiled, used their titles like they were worth more respect just for being there. At first, Darren tried to keep his head down. He'd sweep the floors and empty the trash, pretending he didn't hear. But every time Whitaker smirked at a black customer, Darren thought of his mother's face the day she walked out of that bank with her folder clutched to her chest. He thought of the nights she sat at the kitchen table, counting coins by candlelight. He couldn't pretend it didn't matter. So he started paying attention. He watched which applications got approved, which ones were stalled with excuses. He noticed the same names on the denial letters. He memorized the way Whitaker's jaw tightened when a black customer dared to ask for an explanation. After his shift, he'd walk to the public library with a notebook stuffed in his backpack. He'd sit in a back corner, reading books on civil rights law until the librarian flicked the lights to signal closing time. He learned about the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, all the laws that were supposed to protect people like his mother. But in that bank, those laws were just words no one bothered to follow. Darren wrote down everything he saw: dates, names, the exact words Whitaker used. Part of him didn't know why he was keeping track. He just knew that someone ought to. Remember, someone had to care enough to notice. At home, he didn't tell Gloria about the lists he was making. He didn't tell her how many nights he lay awake, imagining himself standing across from Whitaker one day, not as the janitorial boy, but as someone who could make the old man answer for all those years of disrespect. Instead, he did his chores, finished his homework, and kissed his mother goodnight. But inside, something was shifting. The quiet, watchful boy was growing into a young man who would not look away. The shame that had once weighed on his family was turning into a purpose he could almost touch. He didn't know how he would use what he was learning, but he knew he wouldn't stay silent forever. The heat was so heavy that day it felt like it pressed on your lungs when you tried to breathe. Gloria had been out delivering a dress to one of her regular customers, walking the 3 miles because the bus didn't run often in her neighborhood. By the time she turned onto her street, sweat had soaked the collar of her blouse. She was thinking about supper, about how she'd set aside enough to buy Darren a new pair of shoes next week. Small plans that kept her going. She almost missed the paper tacked to the front door, fluttering just a little in the breeze. She stopped, squinting against the sun, and when she realized what it was, her hands started to shake before she even reached for it. 30 days. That's what it said in bold type. 30 days to leave the house she'd paid rent on, fixed up, loved in. The landlord was selling the property. No offer to help her relocate, no apology. Just a date circled in ink. Gloria pressed the notice against her chest and looked around as if someone might step out from behind the hedges and tell her it was a mistake. But the street was quiet, the afternoon heat bending the air above the pavement. She felt something inside her start to buckle. Darren was home already, sitting at the kitchen table with a textbook open. He looked up when she came in, saw the paper in her hand, and knew something was wrong. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Her boy had never seen her cry, not really. She had always swallowed the tears before they could fall, because she believed a mother had to be a wall. But this time, the wall cracked. She sank into the chair across from him and let the notice slide onto the table. Her face crumpled, and the sob that came out of her chest sounded like it had been waiting years to escape. She covered her mouth, ashamed of the noise, but Darren reached across the table and took her hand. He didn't say it would be all right, because they both knew. He couldn't promise that. He didn't tell her not to cry. He just held her hand tight enough that she could feel his heartbeat. "You're not leaving this place with your head bowed," he said quietly. His voice was steady in a way that startled her. "You've given too much to let them take it from you like this." Gloria wiped her eyes with the hem of her sleeve. She wanted to believe him, to feel that old iron rising in her chest again. But right then, all she could feel was tired. Tired in her bones, tired in her heart. She had spent so long fighting, and some days it seemed like no matter how hard she worked, the ground kept shifting under her feet. Darren stood and came around the table. He put his hand on her shoulder, and for a moment she let herself lean into him, feeling the strength in his young body. She remembered when he was small enough to carry, when he used to fall asleep with his head on her chest. Now he was taller than she was, and his voice had a gravity that made her wonder what kind of man he was becoming. That night, after she had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Darren sat at the same table. He spread out the scholarship application he'd picked up weeks earlier. He'd been too afraid to fill it out, worried he wasn't good enough, that no one would want a black boy from the wrong side of town studying law. But he thought about that notice nailed to their front door. He thought about the way Mr. Whitaker had smirked at his mother all those years ago. And he thought about the dozens of little humiliations that had piled up until they became too heavy for one woman to carry alone. He picked up a pen and began to write. Line after line, he told the truth. About the hours he spent cleaning that bank, about the names he'd heard, about the way his mother had taught him to stand up straight, even when the world tried to make him crawl. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the ink smudged where his palm pressed the page. When he finally looked up, the first light of dawn was slipping under the kitchen curtains. He felt a quiet certainty settling in his chest. He didn't know exactly how he would make it happen, but he knew this much. He was going to do something that mattered. He was going to make them see her worth. And his own. The morning Darren walked back into savings and trust, the air felt almost exactly the same as it had when he was 15, still stale, still cold in that artificial way that never quite reached the corners of the building. But this time, he wasn't carrying a broom or a bucket. He wasn't there to clean up anyone's mess. He paused just inside the doorway, letting the memory of that boy settle behind him like a shadow he didn't need to drag along anymore. His suit was dark and pressed crisp at the edges, the leather briefcase in his hand worn smooth from late nights and long miles. He could feel his pulse steady and strong in his throat. The teller at the front desk looked up, and for a moment she seemed confused, as though she was trying to decide whether to greet him as a customer or wave him back like an errand boy. He introduced himself in a voice that was calm and deliberate, the way he'd practiced 100 times. "My name is Darren Mayfield. I'm here to see Mr. Whitaker." She asked if he had an appointment. "He's expecting me." That wasn't exactly true, but it didn't matter. A few minutes later, the teller returned, ushered him down the hall. Darren could feel the old bank smell rising around him, polish and dust and something sour he couldn't name. He felt the boy he'd been watching from somewhere deep inside. But he kept walking. Mr. Whitaker's office was just the same, only smaller somehow, the corners darker, the carpet worn thin under the chair where so many people had sat, trying to prove their worth. The old man was stooped now, shoulders pulled tight as if the years had weighed him down one disappointment at a time. His hair had thinned to a pale drift across the crown of his head. Whitaker looked up, eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. And then, just for a breath, they widened. Recognition flickered across his face like a candle guttering in a draft. Darren didn't smile. He didn't need to. He set his briefcase on the chair, unlatched it with careful hands, and pulled out a folder thicker than any the old man had ever shoved back across the counter at his mother. "I'm representing New Hope Baptist Church," he said quietly. "We've gathered records of your lending practices over the past 15 years. Whitaker tried to straighten in his seat. His mouth worked, but no words came out at first. Darren continued, voice steady as a metronome. "I've documented 32 applications for loans from black-owned businesses and community organizations. Every single one denied." He laid the papers down on the polished wood, page after page of dates and signatures, and letters of refusal that all sounded the same if you read them out loud. "I also have statements from applicants who were told they weren't a good risk." Darren looked directly into Whitaker's eyes. "Including my mother." The old man blinked, his jaw working again. But he didn't interrupt. He didn't tell Darren he was mistaken or try to wave away the evidence like it didn't matter. Because this time, there was no one to pretend it was acceptable. This time, the law was on Darren's side, and no amount of polite dismissals would wash it away. Darren spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He laid out the history, the patterns, the proof of the discrimination Whitaker's bank had practiced year after year. He never raised his voice. He never called names. He didn't have to. The facts were enough. By the time he finished, Whitaker's eyes had drifted down to the papers between them. His hand rested on the edge of the desk, trembling just slightly. And for the first time Darren could remember, the old man couldn't look him in the face. When it was over, Darren closed the folder and slid it back into his briefcase. He stood without offering a handshake. Whitaker said nothing, his mouth a thin, bloodless line. As Darren turned to leave, he felt something uncoil inside him. Not quite satisfaction, because nothing could give his mother back the years they'd lost, but something close to peace. He had kept his promise. He had come back not as the boy who'd been told to stay quiet, but as a man whose voice mattered. He walked out into the morning light, the door swinging shut behind him, and breathed deep. For the first time, the air didn't smell stale anymore. The settlement came through. The air felt softer somehow, like the sky had decided to lift some of its weight off his shoulders. Darren stood on the steps of New Hope Baptist Church, papers in hand, and watched the congregation gather in small clusters, their voices full of relief and disbelief. After all those years of rejection, the loan had been approved. The foundation would be poured next week. He shook hands, accepted quiet thanks, but all the while his mind was somewhere else. Somewhere far beyond the neat brick buildings and freshly swept sidewalks. He was thinking about a kitchen table, a jar of coins, and the sound of his mother's sewing machine rattling long after midnight. That afternoon, he drove out to the cemetery where Gloria rested under a smooth gray headstone etched with her name and the single word she had lived by: faith. The grass was damp from the morning rain. And for a moment, he stood there with his hands in his pockets, feeling like the boy he used to be, wanting her to see him in his pressed suit, to know he'd kept his word. He knelt beside her grave and set his palm on the cool stone. The words came slow at first, but once he started, they poured out like they'd been waiting years. "I did it, Mama. I came back to that bank and I made them listen. I told them about you. About how you never stopped fighting, even when nobody was watching." He paused, swallowing the ache in his throat. "You were right not to bow your head. Every stitch you sewed was a kind of rebellion. You made them see that you were worth more than they ever admitted. A breeze moved through the trees, and for just a second, he could almost hear her voice, soft and sure, telling him she was proud. When he rose to leave, he felt lighter, like he'd finally set something down he'd been carrying since he was a boy. Before he got back in the car, he drove past the empty lot where the new church would stand. He stepped out and stood there a while, imagining the walls rising, the pews filling with people who would never have to wonder if they belonged. He closed his eyes and let the thought settle in his chest. Dignity could outlast anything poverty, prejudice, even time. And a mother's quiet rebellion could change more than she ever lived to see.